Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So, I think we're ready to begin. So, I wanted to introduce Dale Walker, who kindly agreed to do this joint craft of teaching early Christian studies workshop event for us. Dale, he got his BA in Michigan. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1998. And while here, he served under Professor Hans-Dieter Betz as his advisor. And did a dissertation on 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, a very fascinating and complicated passage. He served as a faculty person at a number of institutions, which include Chicago and also at the University of Wyoming. He's also done a lot of development work and is currently the Director of Development and Alumni Relations at the Divinity School, as well, I believe, at IIT and in the past. Well, in the past.
Is there something I don't know?
I'm sorry, I let that out.
No, you're leaving now.
In the past.
Another job?
But what I think is important is Dale's work as a faculty person and the perspective that he brings to what we all aspire to do one day, the different perspectives that he has doing that with teaching with undergrads in particular. And he just authored a new book called Beyond the Obvious: Doorways to Understanding the New Testament, which is not terribly long, and you can actually read through it fairly quickly. I can go ahead and pass that around. And so we're very excited, and I'd like you to all join me in thanking Dale for agreeing to do this for us, and hopefully giving us all great insights that we can use in our future teaching one day.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Any opportunity to shamelessly plug my book. Janet Scribbler sends her greetings. She emailed me this morning telling me that 140 students were holding up my book. So, I got to plug this in.
It's out of stock on Amazon.
All right. I think that's a good problem. So just quickly, I'll apologize. So, because this book is intended to introduce the New Testament, I'll be talking about introducing the New Testament. So, if any of you are Hebrew Bible or any other discipline here, I apologize, as I will treat you like you aren't here. But it'll just kind of become a habit. So, could you quickly just introduce yourself and tell me what your specialty, your area is? Okay, Richard, I know.
My name is. So just give me time.
I'm Doug Hopper. I'm a first-year PhD student in New Testament and early Christian literature.
I'm Andrew Langford, and I'm a 6th-year PhD student in New Testament and early Christian Latin.
Brandon Klein, New Testament early Christian literature.
Ron Lewis, New Testament.
Allison, New Testament, early Christian literature.
Wow, that's side of the table. Is there a pattern, or are you guys going to break it?
I'm Kelly. I'm a first-year MA focusing on early Christianity.
Okay.
Ben, first-year MA, New Testament.
Christine Trotter, 3rd-year PhD, New Testament, early Christian lit.
Well, I retract my apology. That makes it easy. So there is a football game tonight, so we will end on that, in case anyone's concerned. So the title of my talk is How to Choose a Textbook or Why I Wrote My Own. And so, again, to shamelessly plug my book, I'm going to spend most of the time on the second half. But I'll tell you a few things about the first half as well. Some of it is pretty obvious, but I'll say it just in case you haven't thought about it yet. Go away. So I'll start with a story. In 1989, Will Deming, a graduate, called me up and said, Dale, as you know, I've got a job and I'm leaving Chicago. I was supposed to teach some courses at Loyola this fall, and so they'll need someone to do that in my place. Would you be interested? I said, well, of course I would. So it was awesome. It was also so Will called Loyola, and he told the person in charge, gave him my name. So she called me and asked if I could come in. And so, man, I think I'm coming in for an interview, you know, and I'm like, oh boy, I hope I please them. And like halfway through this conversation, I'm just like, is this an interview or do I already have the job? so stupidly, I just asked, do I already have this job? I'm like, well, yeah, that's why you're here. I'm like, oh. So then I begin to realize what the nature of administrative desperation looks like. And so I'm there because I need a warm body. And so we're talking about the class I'm going to teach. This is awesome. So then I asked, well, is there a syllabus I'm supposed to use, or a course description I'm supposed to follow? And they just look at me like I'm from another planet. Well, it's your class. You do what you want to do, which was both liberating and frightening at the same time, and more of the frightening. They suddenly realized, oh, and then, so you know, okay, great, I'm going to take it. And like 2 weeks later, the administrator called me. There was no email back in those days, and asked if I had made up my mind on a textbook. And I'm like, textbook? But why? I'm still working on the syllabus. I mean, the class doesn't start for like 2 more months. I'm like, yeah, they need your textbook for order in like 2 weeks. Like, oh my goodness. So then I had another frightening moment. Like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about that. I was still worried about what I was going to say, let alone whatever book I was going to use. So here's my first word of advice. Because in my mind I thought, like, you finish, you graduate, you get a job, you've got like this 6-month period where you're thinking about your classes. It may not happen that way. It probably won't happen that way. So it's really kind of a good thing if even now you start thinking about the class you're going to teach I'd always thought long and hard about the class I would teach, but I never actually thought about the textbook. So I had the moment of panic, and maybe that will be your experience too, that the first time you actually have to answer the question, it's a big moment of panic. So here's the obvious things you want to do. You go to AARSBL, you go to the book hall, and you look and see what's out there, so that when you have that moment that suddenly you have to know, you've looked at a few things and you have some ideas, and if you happen to get a on-the-spot interview at SBL to fill in for something, you can say, oh yeah, well, this class, this book, whatever. I mean, because like just something you can talk about, something but you have your short list. So do that. The other thing is, then you just get on your social media and you ask your friends. So I don't know if you're on social media with like Matt Baldwin or Janet Spitler, but they've been shooting emails or posting on Facebook. Anyone got any suggestions for whatever? So I mean, again, didn't have that in my day. So this is a great thing. You can reach out to your friends. What have you used that actually works? So ask around. The other thing I couldn't do in 1989 was Google people's syllabi. Again, you can do that now. So there's some obvious things, and so you should do them. You want to ask the question, what level course, right? Is it a graduate seminar at the University of Chicago where you're going to read monographs? Is it 18-year-olds at a community college where you need a slightly different kind of book? So what level course is it? So those are all obvious things. And how will the book be used? So I'll come clean. My first course evaluations. So one of the questions was, the teacher effectively integrated the textbook into the class. Scale of 1 to 5. Those weren't very high numbers. Never occurred to me that was like something to really obsess about. And actually, I'm not sure that it is. I'll tell you 2 more stories. Here are 2 professors I had as undergraduate who were perhaps the most amazing professors on the planet. So studies have shown that lecturing is like absolutely the worst way to teach. It is, of course, how we have done it traditionally and historically. Well, when I hear things like that, I just wonder, but they didn't have these guys in the survey. Because if they had these guys in the survey, the results would have been different. Professor Marsh, you walked out of his physical geography class with everything just science field and vacuum packed in your brain. I mean, he would do these three-dimensional sketches. I mean, I would try to show you, but I just won't even insult you with my primitive sketching. But I mean, he would have multicolored chalk, and he would do three-dimensional sketches that would demonstrate for you the way water percolates through soil, or the way glaciers carve out valleys, and that is just amazing. So really, we walked out of his lectures like, when I went back to study my notes, you would just look at your notes and go, yeah. I mean, it was already in your brain. So he was, everything was organized well. He had it all down to a T. He performed it splendidly. Alfred Belfison, Introduction to Psychology. He didn't have any three-dimensional sketching skills, but what he had, I heard someone once say about a preacher that was really, what made him a really good preacher was he preached on his toes. And the point being that, there's this wonder in what he was saying that just absorbed his audience. And I would say he wasn't preaching, but Professor Raffleson was teaching on his toes. I mean, when you walked out of his class, you thought that psychology had to be the most amazing topic in the universe, because he just was so enthralled and in love with it as he spoke. But it wasn't just his passion and love, it was his organization. I mean, every syllable of that class was organized from first to last. I mean, every class was self-contained and coherent. Here's what I'm talking about. Here are the three experiments that illustrate it, and they were just perfect. I mean, it was an amazing display of prowess. So it just so happened that circumstances later, with Professor Raffleson, a couple years later, I passed him in a hallway. And Professor Marsh, I actually had an email exchange with like 20 years later. And so I asked him, okay, Professor Raffleson, I just get you were the most amazing professor. And we were like, what's your secret? And I'll tell you the secret that they both shared. They prepared. Which, I mean, it's kind of disappointing. But Professor Raffleson, so when I got him, I'm going to guess he was 65 years old. And he said, well, I always take an hour and prepare before every class. So think, here's a 65-year-old full professor that takes an hour before Introduction to Psychology to prepare. He teaches 2 sections a semester, 2 semesters, 30 years. So that means he's actually spent like 60 hours preparing that lecture, right? So preparation. And it was clear with Marsh that, it's preparation. Well, the Marsh was funny too. He's like, well, I tell you, sometimes I'm walking down the halls at school and I'll stop and I'll listen to what the professor's saying. And I'm just like, do you even care? Do you even try? Just why can't? Anyway, so really preparation, and you kind of wish there was something more magical than that. But these 2 guys, that was their secret, preparation. Now, why am I telling you about them? Because coming back to the question on the teacher evaluation. Integrates the coursework well with the class. Well, these guys didn't. Well, they sort of did, but they did. So, if you were going to judge a good teacher by that question, these guys don't really measure up. So, with Marsh, he wrote his own textbook. This is a much prettier cover than the edition I had when I was a student. He wrote his own textbook. So basically, the textbook served the role as, if there was something in class that maybe you didn't quite catch or were confused about, you could go to the textbook. There was a little backup there for you. How do you spell that word? I didn't quite understand that concept. It's in the textbook. You could go back, fill it in case you didn't get it in class. Then, of course, so that was a class where you could read the textbook and not come to class. To which I would go like, why would you do that when you become here this most amazing lecture? Anyways, so this textbook, I guess you could say it was thoroughly integrated because, in fact, the lecture was the content of the textbook. Alfred Raffleson, he gave us one of those big introductory to psychology textbooks, and I don't think he talks about it ever. He didn't need to. I mean, he was his own self-contained textbook. So, again, if you're going to come to the course evaluation and you come to that question, I'm just looking at, I look at that question and go like, yeah, who cares? So sometimes the questions you get asked are not really the right questions to be asked. But nevertheless, in the broader scheme of things, administrators think that, and if you're going to spend $200 on a textbook, I really want it to be integrated with class. that it is an important question to ask. How is it integrated into class? And that's what you have to ask yourself as you're picking a textbook. Okay, the first time I'm just desperate, and so bam, you grab a couple because I think I could be useful. Just use them, and I'll make do. Somehow or other, I will make them relevant. But as you go along, you want to have a more in sync and in phase dialogue going on with your book. So the question you have to ask is, why am I using this book in the class, and how do I plan to use it? Now, so obviously the question you have to ask before that, right? What do I want to do in the class? So as you think about what you want to do in the class, then you can move to the textbook and get there. So I'm preparing for this. I was thinking about this first class I taught. Like, yeah, what textbook did I use? Yeah, Spivey and Smith, Anatomy of the New Testament. And I thought, I won't. But I tried to remember the book. And I remember that I liked the chapter on Matthew, and I can't remember anything else about the book. So I pulled it down off my shelf, and I was like really shocked to find out that like I had underlined things in the book. Like, oh, I did read it. So what a wonderful book. I don't remember a thing. I should have admit that if I was being, but anyways. I think my degree is safe. So what do you want to do in the class? Now, a few better questions. Who is your audience, and what is your institution? So, undergraduates at community college, adult learners, somewhere in the middle, normal, traditional students, not traditional students. What is the nature of the institution? Are you at a seminary? Are you at a community college? Are you at a liberal arts college? Are you at a university? What's the nature? And therefore, what is the culture? So here in Chicago, I mean, we have a culture of sitting around a table with an open book, open text, talking about texts. So, that could be, the real textbook in the Dieter Betts seminar was, well, back in the day, it was Nestle's 26th edition. I think you guys have moved on. But not the dean. You really can't get a new one.
It's downstairs.
Saturday, I think I have about 5 because I'll go to SBL and I'll see them and I can't remember, did I ever get the new edition? And I'll buy it and I go, oh, I guess I did. So if anybody needs one. So you have to think about in the culture of your institution. I mean, the culture is, you're staying in a giant auditorium with 400 people lecturing. So the nature of your institution, all that's going to come into play. And the sad thing is, the first time you do that, you're not really in and out, right? So I did make an effort to go to Loyola and check out the classroom to figure out kind of what it was going to be. And it turned out to be a 30 by 30 square with a chalkboard in front. Whoa, I didn't see that coming. So what do you want to accomplish? I've already talked about. But let's just reframe it a second. So we're talking about a textbook. But let's get rid of the word textbook and ask the question, what do you want your students to read? But then let's reframe that question. How do you want your students to participate in their own education, in the process of learning within the class? So what it is that you want them to do, then that's going to backtrack from there to how it's going to get accomplished, and then what is the nature of the thing they want to read. So maybe in a class you want them to read scholarly journal articles. Maybe that's the way to key in on your goals. Now, just some other things, miscellaneous. So my experience, this is one. So here's this 500-page book, right? This really is 500 skinny pages. I had so many students who would rather read this than the New Testament, and that just blew my mind. And so you ask yourself, so what do you want your student to leave your introduction to New Testament class taking away? I read Spivey Smith. No, I want them to walk away having read the New Testament, which isn't that much reading, right? I mean, really, you could knock that off in a week. Maybe 3 weeks the way undergraduate student. But still, it's a pretty easy thing to knock off. So for me, I started with Spivey Smith. I don't know, I don't know if I used it for 1 year or 2. But after realizing that the students were reading this and not reading the New Testament, I got rid of this, and I didn't have a textbook. So at that point, I just used the New Testament and made sure they had homework that made them read the New Testament. And that seemed to be my challenge for that particular situation. Now, when I've done continuing education classes, now, you got 50-year-old adults with multiple college degrees, and, they crave reading. So there, I wouldn't just say read the New Testament, then I would have books, depending on what the nature of the class was, or maybe ancient texts of some sort. But I've found most of the time, so here I am plugging a textbook, and I'm going to tell you most of the time I just use primary text. But ask how your students will participate in learning. I mean, I think that's the real critical question to ask with a textbook. So now I'm going to move on to why I wrote my own. And the real thing is, with every class you teach, is you're finding your own voice. So the thing that I thought was kind of weird when I taught that first course at Loyola was I went and looked at the course description, and it said nothing. It was like, students will encounter the New Testament. I mean, something like really that vague, And I thought, like, if you ever, read the course descriptions for courses at elite liberal arts colleges, they're awesome. I mean, they're just like, oh wow, I want to take that class. They're like these really juicy, and so then I read this description, like, yeah, no, it kind of doesn't. So is it like the people at Loyola just are stupider? No, what's going on here is administratively you're leaving space for the faculty member to do what they want to do, which is really a great thing. I mean, it's liberating, it's freeing, it's exciting. But on the other hand, you have to figure out what you want to do, so it's also frightening. So, but the thing is, you have to find your own voice. So, I mean, one thing, and I was a slave to this. I mean, here are these books like this that are a survey of the New Testament or an introduction to the New Testament. And so my first few times out of the gate, I was really a slave to that. Like, this is the way you have to teach the New Testament, and you got to talk about all the books of the New Testament. So I was a real slave where that was concerned, and you do that a few times, and then you realize you're bored, and then you step back and ask yourself, so why did I find the New Testament interesting enough to study in the first place? I mean, what jazzed me about it? And then that's what you start thinking about bringing to the classroom, and what interested me. And then you want to maybe stop and think about what interests your students. So another institutional context, at Loyola they were there because it was a graduation requirement. They had to take 2 theology courses. I was one of 2. So, they're there because they gotta be. At other schools, they'll be there because it's a total elective and they choose to be there. So, what's motivating the student to be there and what do they want to get out of it? If it's a free choice to be there, then they actually might have some type of question that they're there to try to get an answer to. And so, what were the questions you had? What did they have? And construct a course that excites you and excites them. And then figure out how are they going to contribute to the learning, and then what do they need to read to do that. So the real goal of writing my own is finding my own voice. And so here's the shameless plug, the title, the picture of the book. And if you had a copy in front of you, you would find in italics, in an introduction, what seems obvious and straightforward provides access to some of the most important questions about the New Testament and consequently Christian history. So now I'm going to have to tell you about the book, just a wee bit. But first, there is a pop quiz. And I'm sorry the dean is here, so she's just not going to look at how slowly or quickly you write the... But I want you to take out a piece of paper. I'm serious. We're going to have a pop quiz.
How long is this book?
Oh, yeah, there'll be 10 questions. 10 questions, and...
Do we need to keep it in front of us, so I can just use the paper I'm already using, or do you want...
No.
Is this an open book
So this quiz is a quiz that I give on the opening session of every Introduction to New Testament class. And the reason I give it is twofold. One is to calibrate me to my audience, because I will tell you this. No matter how hard you try, you are always going to overshoot your crowd. Until you've been in a place for years, then maybe get a sense of it. But I think that your first few times out of the gate, you're going to overshoot your audience. And not because you're up there trying to prove how smart you are, you're just going to forget what it is to know nothing. The other part of the problem is the students who do think they know. So the worst problem I ever had with a student was a Baptist minister who, I know the Bible. And anything I said about scholarship, she just rejected out of hand. So, she went and talked to the department chair. The department chair called me in and said, no, I have to tell you this, but by the way, don't worry about this because, I know what this is all about. You're doing a great job. But, so I would give this quiz so that it would help me gear down to the students. But at the same time, so at Loyola, a lot of students, most of the students had come to the Catholic system. So they just kind of walked in thinking this was Sunday school again. And so, I'm going to get an easy A in this because I already know this. So the point of this test was to disabuse them of that. But what I told them, I'm just going to give you some really easy questions about the New Testament. And, let's just see how you do. So question number 1 is, how many books are there in the New Testament? Hopefully that didn't. Oh, and slams the pen down. I'm on that one. Way to go. Question number 2, how many Gospels are there? Question number 3, name them.
Where was the period in that sentence?
I'm sorry. How many Gospels are there in the New Testament? Oh, see? It's hard.
Paul's Gospel.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question right now. Question number 3, name them. And question number 4, true or false? Jesus wrote the New Testament. Question number 5, in what language was the New Testament written? Question number 6, in what century did the events of the New Testament take place? Yeah, that's a trick question. What's the next number? In what century did the events of the New Testament take place? What number am I in?
7.
So you're waiting for 7 or waiting for 8? You're waiting for 7. What at the time of the New Testament, what was the dominant political power in the world of the New Testament? I forget how I phrased that question. In the world of the New Testament, what's the dominant political power? So now you're waiting for question number 8. Name a modern-day country in which an event in the New Testament takes place. Oh, what religion was the earliest Christians? And question number 10, quote a sentence from the New Testament. Now, I'm just going to assume everyone here aced this quiz, except for we'll get to some problems. But I gave this quiz to a few hundred students, and I think maybe 3 aced it. So, what I will tell the students is, these are kind of really basic questions involved in the study of the New Testament. So, and I will actually have, don't put their names on it, it's not great, but I will have to ask them. I do want to take these poems, I do hand them in, but let's just go through these questions. So, I assume everybody here knows the answer. Number 1 is 27. Now, one thing I really tried to avoid in my book is test questions. So I didn't say that there are 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. I said there are over 100. I really tried to avoid things that an undergraduate reading would highlight as, oh, that's going to be on a test, In writing my book, I did not want students to focus on the trivia. That information is there to get to a bigger point, and I wanted to try to keep the bigger points in their purview. So I really wouldn't expect an undergraduate class to memorize the number 27. But here's what I would put. The number 27 is now out there. They may choose to memorize it or not. What I find when I would give a test more interesting is how do you think about it. So how many books are in the New Testament? Option A, 4. Option B, 13. Option C, 18. Option D, 27. Option E, 39. So once they've read the New Testament, they know there are 4 Gospels and more stuff. They may have heard the number, there are 13 Pauline letters. 4 Gospels is 17, and more stuff, so 18 is not going to work. 39 seems too big, I'm going to go with 27. So whether or not they remember the exact number 27, once they've read the New Testament, hopefully they can think their way to an answer like that. Now, when the students take this test, like, the numbers are all over the board. I mean, like, either somebody was a fundamentalist and knows it's 27, or the numbers are just wild guesses. The next one is really interesting. How many Gospels are there in the New Testament? And a number of people will guess that one correct, but the numbers will be low. They won't be that wild. And now, so you guys are thinking, well, like the Pauline Gospel. Undergraduates, that's not going to come to their mind. So we'll be talking. The question will focus on the evangelists. Now, the next question is a really interesting one: is name them. So, does everybody have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Does anybody have them in a different order? The most brilliant thing when undergraduates get all 4 right in the wrong order. And this blows my mind. Like, so they know them, but they, like me, I memorized them, got a candy bar for it. So they know them, but in a whole different way than the way. So I mean, how have they experienced them? As picture windows, as just readings in service? I mean, that's like a really interesting question to see what order they put them in, what they thought, And so like when I'm giving the test, like I'm watching to see like who's thinking and writing, because that's the person I'm going to call on to answer the question. So, anyways, yeah. So name them, false. Greek. So the 6 is really interesting, right? Because even if you don't know, couldn't you figure that out? Couldn't you kind of guess the 1st century? Now you're thinking, well, okay, but there's a little bit before the 1st century, and then it goes into the 2nd century. Undergraduates, don't worry about that. You're just thinking, when I asked that question the first time, they're like, surely they understand what the calendar is, and they'll just think that's a really stupid question. So no, they don't know what the calendar is. And then, they're not likely to know Rome. This is an interesting one, because here, like, you've got a Loyola Greek student, so they all answer Greece. So, this is correct. So there are a lot of options. It's kind of interesting to see where people think. But this one's interesting because, like, the students think, well, they're Christian, right? So that opens up a really nice dialogue about, well, when does the word Christian come, and then what are they? What are they? I mean, And then quote sentence from the New Testament is interesting because, like, most of them will think that they don't know. They just won't write anything. And then, someone will raise their hand and, well, our Father who art in heaven. And then it was like, oh, that's in the New Testament. I know that one. So they'll be surprised, like.
That counts?
Yeah. So, so that's kind of, so the test both helps me calibrate to the students and helps the students realize that, there might be a few things I can learn in this class that I never heard before.
Can I just ask, do you give it again at the end?
I did, yeah, actually, and things get a lot better.
Yeah. Just for them to sort of see that they know something.
Although those questions, actually, in what language is an interesting question because, all of us know Greek, but the answers, well, some say English, but given it was a Catholic at Loyola, a lot of answers are Latin, right? That's a totally rational answer. So that creates a really interesting discussion about translation and things. And some people will guess Hebrew, which again, rational guess. So the questions maybe in that form or not in that form or some type of multiple choice, whatever I got to test. But they do come back up because, so here's the thing. So I gave this quiz a number of times. And then, after giving it a number of times, I just kind of asked myself, so what? I mean, there are reasons why I'm giving this quiz, but like, does this information really, does it matter? Does it really matter if they walk out of my class going, 1st century, Greek, Mediterranean world with Rome? And I think the answer is, it does matter because all of those things become important elements of the interpretations that we will go into. So it is the world of the Mediterranean, it is the power that is Rome, it is Greek. And on a timeline, it is the 1st century in parts of the So it does matter. And so then that made me think about, okay, well, why does it matter? And how do I take this These are really easy questions to ask on an objective part of the test, which I know it seems bad to do, but you know, when you got 100 tests to grade, the objective part goes so much quicker. I always have essays. Don't be appalled. I always have essays. But some students, they're just better on objective than essays, so you give that to them so it plays to their strength. So other than the fact that these are easy to do on an objective part of the test, why do it? And so that's really this is the genesis of this book. Is asking that question. Okay, it's written in Greek, so why is that meaningful to this group of 18-year-olds who are never going to read Greek? And how do I communicate to them that it does make a difference? Again, institutional setting will make a difference. If you have immigrants, first-generation Americans in your class, you might actually have someone who's bilingual. And if you have someone who's bilingual, that really helps. If you're stuck in a class of all English speakers, then you know you're talking to people who have no idea that things actually get lost in translation. So the chapter in there, the New Testament is written in Greek. Oh, right. Well, I guess I should move on to that. Oh, by the way, here's a little pedagogical thing. Pretesting improves learning. So this test, so this is a pattern that you might consider incorporating into your classes. Pretesting as you move into new information. It helps orient students to what you think is important. So again, I come back to the sentence, and so here are the 7 chapters. So very obvious things about the New Testament. The New Testament is a library. The New Testament was written in Greek. The New Testament was written. So actually, you know, I never thought about this until I wrote this book. And I was writing this chapter. The New Testament was written in Greek. And so, well, I thought about the fact it's written. And then the more I thought about the fact that it was written, I realized, well, that's really its own essay. And that's really its own point. I mean, is there anything more obvious about the New Testament than it's written? And have you ever stopped to think about that? I'd never stopped to think about that. So,
why did you choose the sequencing? Why not the New Testament was written before the New Testament was written in Greek? Maybe if I read the chapters, I would know.
Yeah, no, actually, so the chapters try not to link to each other. I mean, inevitably there are references, and I reflect that, but I tried to write them as isolated independent units, and I'll talk about that later. But because I kind of thought that this was an interesting surprise. You're right. I mean, they could be, and so I mean, one of the people who read the book before it was published said, well, why isn't that? Paul wrote first. Why isn't that the first one? And the reading, well, so they could be in lots of orders, but I just kind of thought that was a nice surprise. You don't.
I took note.
And Paul wrote first. I put at the end because when I think majority of people, when they come to study New Testament, they're more interested in Jesus and the Gospels. So starting with Paul just kind of throws them off. Why are we talking about Jesus? There's a reason why you talk about Paul first, and then I'll give it to you at the end. I don't know, so that's just, but they could be assigned in any order. They're not like building from chapter to chapter. It's not a scholarly monograph. It's building an argument. You were distributed, Paul wrote first. And so I hope at least 2 of you read it, because I want to ask a real question. Is this essay an introduction to Paul? So if someone read it, would you care to answer that question? I know Richard read it, but I won't make Richard answer. Yes?
I would say no. My impression of it is you did a great job handling different topical areas of like how Paul relates to Jesus or how Paul relates to Judaism. But it didn't start with the biographical information about where was Paul born, what do we know about his childhood and education. So in that sense, I would say it's not strictly introduction.
I'd say it depends on what we mean by introduction. Because if we're trying to understand the New Testament, especially in relation to other parts of the New Testament, then as Christine pointed out, when you talked about that, then in a way this does orient one to deal with some kind of study of the New Testament text. Mm-hmm. So while it may not be a fully encompassing biography of Paul, it will help the student orient his or herself to dealing with Paul in a more competent manner than they had in the past. So in that way, I think it could be an introduction.
Allison?
And it struck me as more a companion piece in some ways, like there aren't quotations or references to the New Testament, and I thought that was really great, because then you have to read the New Testament alongside it. So it wouldn't work alone as an introduction if you weren't also reading the New Testament. I think you wouldn't totally understand what was going on.
Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, my impressions were the same as Allison's, and I was intrigued by the lack of New Testament references. And I'm curious if you could say more about why you chose to do that, or why that was, I don't know, a choice.
There was a fight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was a fight with your editors or whatever, but I mean, that was one thing that really stuck out to me. You know, when there were a lot of claims made about Paul and Paul's thinking, and I'm wanting references, and I wanting, as a teacher, I would also want students to go to the New Testament and read some of that for themselves, you know. So I'm curious, yeah, how you imagine this text working as a companion piece to someone reading the New Testament, like their students reading the New Testament.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wanted all that stripped out because one of my driving goals for this book is that it's readable and it's read quickly. So there's no point in a book that isn't read. You can have the greatest book assigned, but if it's not read, it's pointless. And the other part is making it manageable. And so the essay's approximately 10,000 words each. If you read 250 words a minute, that's a 40-minute read. If you're 200 words a minute, that's a 50-minute read. So you should be able to tell your students, you know, you should be able to read this essay under an hour. So, you know, book an hour, you'll get it done. And then when you're estimating the workload for your student, then, you know, you go, okay, an hour. And then, but to your question, so I see it as a way, so I would have them read this before the lecture, and so that it to incite their questions. And so one of the questions might be, where in the heck is he getting this from? And I hope that nothing I said was opaque to a scholar, so that you know, you would know that's Romans 8. So a part of it, part of it is also my fundamentalist background, where every sentence ends with a reference, and that just gets in the way. So first off, that's a bad way of thinking, because you take a sentence out of a verse and you call that a thought. So I don't like the atomistic approach to the Bible that fundamentalists use. And then it also disrupts reading. So part of that is my own baggage, but it's mostly about reading that I want people to just keep moving. Because the point of the reading of this isn't that they memorize 7 details and walk away. The point is, this is the point of the chapter right there. So the point of this is that you walk away going, yeah, Paul wrote first. Wow, it made a difference. So, you know, any individual New Testament scholar could disagree with any number of things that I said. And that's fine. Because one of the things that I tried to do as I wrote was to minimize my authority. So, you haven't read the whole book, so you wouldn't know. But in the introduction, you know, I thought, you know, here's some things that I think that I don't try to hang arguments on in this book, but it's what I think, and sometimes it's what I think, and so it's what I have to say. But a lot of people would disagree with this. So, you know, I tried to position myself as a reliable guide, but someone with whom one could easily pick an argument. So that hopefully the students aren't just reading the book with complete confidence, but will come to the teacher and say, really? Paul didn't know Jesus? Really? I mean, and that's the point. I mean, I hope that a New Testament professor could pick up on that. I mean, don't use the book if you can't. But so I see the students coming back and asking questions. Where do you get that from? And the professor just has to be familiar enough with the text to know. I mean, sometimes I do put some references in there, but with Paul. So I recently read, there's this book, 4 Views of Paul. I don't know if you've seen it. And I thought, that could be a really interesting book for a class. And so I read it, and the first essay just made me retch. And it was a guy who's presenting a Reformed opinion, and every sentence ends with a Bible citation. As if, you know, you take 6 sentences out of Paul and you put them next to each other, and now you have Paul's thought. You know, it's just, you have no responsibility to think it through and to really figure out what the structures of this thought are. You just quote 6 sentences and that fills out. That's, you know, again, it comes back to that sort of fundamentals through theology, what repulses me. So I didn't want to do that. You know, so I want, my goal is the students are looking at the big picture, and then and I'll come back to that again later. So I think I've answered your question enough. And I really like your comments because it's not an introduction to Paul. And again, the external reader mistook it for that. It's like, well, every chapter has a thesis statement for the title. This is the title. Yeah, there is nothing in there about the life, the chronology of Paul, the biography of Paul. Some of it comes up, but it's not the point of the chapter. Now, Richard, I think is absolutely functionally, it could become the introduction if no one, you know, it will introduce the student to Paul for the class. But again, the problem when you do an introduction to Paul, actually Dieter Betz's article is really good. That's a good introduction to Paul. It's a really good introduction to Paul. So you could read that if you want an introduction to Paul. But the problem with most introductions is now you put the kitchen sink and everything is in there, and then you just get so overwhelmed with everything that you lose sight of anything. And so the point is to put enough in there to get something, but then hopefully enough in there to make you want more and move forward. So there's a larger plan for this book. So in the digital world, most stuff started as brochure, where you had paper brochures and then you got the internet, and so you threw what you had up on. And then the next step is to create stuff that's born digital, right? So this book is actually born digital, even though it emerges in print. So my larger plan is to disbundle the essays and make them available. No, so Anselm Press didn't have a digital plan when we first talked, and so I just kind of rolled the dice that they would get one. So if this works, if Anselm can make money on this book and it's an idea that works, then of course the essays can be multiplied. I mean, Jesus Was a Jew would be a great essay. The Evil Herod Was Great. That would be an interesting essay. So they could be expanded because, like, why isn't there an essay in there about the Jewish background or the Roman background? I mean, one, not because I'm trying to keep it a small book, but the real question is, if you just bundled it electronically and you had 30 essays, then you could pick the 6 for your class that are relevant to the class that you're teaching, and they could be Hebrew Bible or any early Christian literature, right? And then Anselm actually does have a digital play now, and so you should be aware of this. They do have a thing where you can bundle the class that you want. They'll provide the service. You tell them, here are the 17 readings I want. They'll get permissions. They'll put it together for you. And I hadn't thought about this, but I was talking to a guy Saturday night who said that his students won't read the PDFs. They want paper. They want a book to read, which I kind of blew my mind. And I thought that young people didn't want a book. But he was like, he's fine. They'll read the paper copy book he gives them, they read. The PDFs he gives them digitally, they don't. And then another guy was talking about, well, actually, I have a student who reads his PDFs on his cell phone, and I can't imagine reading a 10,000 word. That's a lot of little screens, But so this is actually something that they're doing. I'm sure other people will get on board. But once you've got essays, then why not add pedagogical materials, maps, or whatever, right? So my bigger picture, this is a digital play. Oh, another shameless plug. Okay, so the guiding principles, why I wrote what I wrote. User-centered design is what I'm trying to practice here. And quickly, here are products that were designed with the user in mind. So we all know this, this Apple and Steve Jobs' obsession even with font. OXO, the story you probably don't know. Anyone have an OXO utensil in your kitchen? This is wonderful. When Sam Farber invented OXO, no one thought that anyone would pay $5 for a potato peeler. That was insanity. Sam Farber and his wife were in the southern France. They were retired. He sold one company. They were retired, and they're cooking dinner. His wife has arthritis, and she complains to Sam, "Why can't anyone make a potato peeler for people with arthritis?" And Sam, being the entrepreneur that he was, like, "Bam! Why can't we?" So, long story short, he started a company with a potato peeler. And his friends in the house were just cracked up thinking about this. Here comes Sam into this, I mean, you know, the SBL exhibition hall. This is small compared to what happens at corporate exhibition. I mean, like, you know, 4,000 square feet, a company will have 4,000 square feet of exhibition space. So here's Sam at one of these huge things. He has a 6-foot-long table with potato peelers stacked up. So everyone's coming to see what Sam's got, and they're just cracking up. The dude's there with the potato peeler. But he had a vision for a company, and so, but the whole point was, how do people use it, and how does it work for them? So, you know, my favorite thing is you know, the little measuring spoons where, you know, the old timey, it's all metal and you stamp it and you can't read what, is it 1/2, is it, but you know, it's black and it's white with the lettering. You know, it's a 1/2 teaspoon. I can see that, even with that. So anyway, so Sam asked, what is the user's experience? With the Miata, there was all about what is the user's experience? If you've used the ESPN app, that was designed by people who were focused on the user experience. TurboTax, Intuit, was the 47th company to come out with tax software. In the digital world, it's the first in who wins. They were number 47 and they crushed because they focused on how does the user experience using our software. Does anybody use TurboTax? Yeah. Those of you who don't eventually. So that's kind of the mentality I was trying, that I'm advocating for you. I tried using my book, and when you think about your class, I would advocate. So, I mean, other ways you might orient your class, you know, my dissertation. We're going to talk about a really important topic today. But, you know, right now in our schooling system, it's teaching to the test. It could be discipline-centered. Here's what I think, this is what I think people need to know, so this is what I'm going to follow. Or it's just the way it's always been done. So, a moment of empathy. You are not your students, and you can read this, so I'm not going to. But, you know, you read the book. You're unusual. You know your material. They don't. You're in love with it. They haven't made up their mind. They don't really care about, you know, your discipline, quad discipline. And here's not. They may not know what an effective study habit looks like. And I know when I taught, I just assumed everybody did. And that's a huge mistake I made in my past. And, of course, your students probably leave the academy. So I was trying to make it meaningful, manageable, brief. Another thing I was trying with the essays is to make things synthetic. So, you know, so here are 2 common books that we have. You know, this kind of goes over the content of the testimony. And then these tomes that tell us who, when, where, what, why. And I mean, listen, these really atomized things. So now there's a chapter on Mark Scott's book. Now we're going to talk about who wrote it. Now we're going to know when they wrote it. Now we're going to know why they wrote it. You know, everything just gets broken down and atomized. So in my essays, I'm very consciously trying to be synthetic. So, can you tell us in Greek? Well, you can talk about any of the 27 books with something like that. With Paul wrote first, well, okay, it's only Paul. But, you know, you're crossing all his letters. So my goal is to cross things. And interleaving improves learning, or think of it as cross-training. So another pedagogical principle. I also chose essays because that's the way that we actually, okay. This is really bad for my bosses here. I haven't used a footnote since 1998, okay? Essays, that's a useful way to learn how to write because you may write long form. But the actual research paper just isn't something that comes up in my workaday life, generally speaking. So I wanted to work in essays because that's the way that you actually ask your students to write essays. And so when I told one person about this, they just went, well, they were supposed to learn how to write an essay in high school. Well, yeah, aren't you the guy who complains about his idiot students? I mean, it's like, yeah, they were supposed to, but you can always learn. I mean, yeah, I got better at it when I was in college. So I mean, I like the form essay because that's actually a form in which they will be writing to you. And so the book also becomes a way of you talking to your students about what an essay might look like. So pick it up. You like it, you don't like it. This is good, this is bad. And creativity. Again, not a topic that I heard a whole lot in my education, but I think is really critical. So I have things in this book that are very explicitly about creativity. And then I told you earlier, I tried to unsettle myself in my authority. So easy reading, address general education, and then invite people to a conversation. Don't just take what I have to say, but invite them to a conversation. So those are the really 3 things I'm trying to do with the book. And this, So in the chapters, there's some specific things I tried to do. In terms of creativity, the New Testament is a library. Well, literally it is. The second half of the essay is, well, let's think about it analogically. So what if you think of the New Testament and use the Regenstein Library as a model? What happens in Regenstein Library? So if the New Testament is a library and we think analogically, what might we think about the New Testament? So I used an analogy, which is a really, analogy and metaphor are two great tools for creativity. So I used, so that was consciously chosen to do in that first essay as a way of creativity. The New Testament in Greek is a chance to talk about the aesthetics of a text. So I got to bring in beauty and aesthetics. The New Testament is written structural. What I mean by structural is, cause and effect. I mean, what are like Richard Saller's book on Roman patronage? That's a structure of how things function in society. It's not just A, B, but there are 27 variables and they're interacting with each other. So structure. So the New Testament is written, well, that requires readers, that requires writers, that requires education. Education requires a curriculum, that requires a social context. So what is the social structure that allows you to have a written text? There are 4 Gospels, so you get to talk about cause, how A leads to B, but also what are the factors that lead one person to write this Gospel and this to write to another. Suspicion, the Gospels are not. So okay, I have to, number 5, that is not an obvious thing. That's the least obvious thing about any of these things up here. And some people would actually disagree with that, but anyways. So teaching, suspicious. There are more than 4 Gospels. The real point of that, that's information. I mean, a lot of people don't know that yet. So they know there are things in the New Testament, but expanding their point of view. And then structural, David Hellholm years ago in class taught us to think about things in terms of form, content, structure, which are kind of obvious, but I never really put it together as a toolkit in my mind before. So I use that to talk about, well, what is a gospel? And use those 3 categories. Now, I don't come to an answer, so this is what it is. But the point is, here are 3 tools, a set of tools that your student could take and use for a lot of different things. And then in the conclusion, again, came back to the creativity part. In the conclusion, it's not really a conclusion, it's really a separate essay. But what it talks about is creativity in New Testament scholarship and creativity in the New Testament. And looking at different ways that New Testament authors were creative and how some of those same dynamics are the way that current scholars can be creative. So the point being, if you want to be creative, there are actually things you could try to do. You could try to go find a new manuscript. Get new information is one way of being creative. Bring new information to the party. So Dieter Best brings rhetorical criticism and Galatians to the party, and thousands of papers get written. Dieter Best brings our attention to the Maxwell party. Thousands of papers get written. So, anyways, so that's actually just there for that. Now, so how, to Brandon's question, how would I use this in class? So you're teaching New Testament class, how are you going to organize it? Well, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, I'm going to march all the way to Revelation. I'm going to put Paul up front, and I'm going to clumper things a little bit. Or I'm teaching Jesus, creation of Gospels, formation of church, I can do. Or I'm going to focus on genres. So all of these things up here share the same thing. It's linear, right? You're just going to start and boom, race to the end. Well, what if you went in cycles? Again, my attempt at sketching. So here's, on a 3-month course, you might think about 3 cycles. So I would start with my book as just a quick way of getting through a lot of stuff. You get through the Gospels, you get through some early Christian literatures, you get through Paul, and then you come back and then you take a slower stroll through, and then take the focus off the textbook and now go to the New Testament. And you're reading the New Testament. And then, now that you've gone through a book and you've gone through the New Testament, now you come to the end and now you get to the questions that you really want to get to, right? I mean, aren't these really the things you want to talk about? But the problem is how do you talk about the story of Jesus if they haven't read a gospel, right? So so this is what you're really trying to get to. So I would try to do that. And again, now we're doing distributed learning. We're spreading the learning over time and in cycles. So I just read this really interesting thing, and it's too late for me. But it was about vocabulary acquisition. And if you take a list of words, study them today, and study them again tomorrow, and put it away for a week. Study them in a week, put it away for a month, study for a month, your retention will be significantly better than if you sit down today and cram for an hour, and sit down tomorrow and cram for an hour, and just keep going at it, hammering at it. Actually, the space improves, and that this is totally counterintuitive. I so wish someone would have told that to me 30 years ago. But the other thing is, of course, using knowledge makes it your own. So, you get it, get some of it, you go through it again, and now you get to the big questions, and you can start asking the questions you want to use, and now you're drawing from this. And this process is iterative. So when you write a paper, you write a draft, right? And then you improve it, you get another draft. So that's an iterative process. And the great thing I liked about working with creatives was thinking of it that way. Because, writing is thinking, okay. And as we write, we're thinking, okay. And then we improve our paper. But I just like the word iterative because instead of using the word draft, call it a prototype. Okay, this is the prototype of my thought. And now I'm going to rewrite it in a second iteration, and I'm improving the prototype. I'm still not really happy with this prototype, but now that I have a prototype, I can actually see what the problems are. So, product development is just amazing. Like, just take paper and ink pens and staplers and glues, tape something together. What do you know about that? And it's like, it's so stupid, but yet, you hold it in your hand, and then you suddenly get to realize, oh, if I held it this way, it'd be way more comfortable. If it were a little lighter, mine would fatigue more slowly. And now you're onto something, right? So so your papers are prototypes going through an iterative process. So take that to your teaching. You're leading your students iteratively through material and back through. They pick up more sense. So another thing with my book, I'm trying to give people a matrix for stuff to hang on. So you get 7 ideas, 7 basic general ideas. Now you can hang stuff on that. But also, hopefully, you remember how a few things hang off each one. So I'm trying to make stuff sticky so that as they keep going through it, there's stuff to latch onto. And and all this fits in. So it's all good. So what do you think good teaching is? So if you've talked with people about good teaching, you always hear the word empathy. Sometimes you will typically hear the word passion, and sometimes, you hear the word organization. Those are 3 common things you'll hear. So I like to take those and blow them up into larger concepts. So passion is about performance. So it's your passion, but it's also your self-presentation. I don't have any patience for someone who thinks it's okay to get up and not know how to use technology. It's a really simple thing to plug my computer in. You should know how to do that. You should know before you come to class how to plug that in. You can I came up here earlier today and checked how to plug it in. But what are you saying to your students when you get up and look like a Luddite? Like it's okay, you can go into the professional world and be a Luddite? This is not a good way to go into the professional world. The person, it's not a good way. But model the way. So how do you learn? It's good to be transparent. How do you learn things? And tell that with your students. Don't assume they know. Organization, but think of it as management. Do my people have what my people need to succeed? Do they need a little encouragement? Define what is it? So I always thought it was like a guessing game. Is this a good paper? Is like, I don't know, just let's find out. But tell a student what excellence looks like. Tell your class, here's what doing well looks like. Here's what a good paper looks like. Here's what a good essay looks like. Define excellence and make it easier for them to get there. So you think of it as managing. It's not just, your syllabus is a great example of organization. But broaden it. Think about you are a manager of this process and of these people. And then learner-centered empathy, cognitive science. So read. Take a day every year and read up on decision-making science or learning science. People are doing real work in this. So bone up on that. And then path to innovation is another, if it's learner-centered, you yourself are on a path to innovation as a teacher. So that all comes back to this book, thinking about the larger picture of how I think education, what I want to do as an educator. So I'm trying to manage the process. I'm trying to help them see what a good essay will look like. I'm trying to help them get information that will stick. I'm trying to be sensitive to what will be learning to them, et cetera, et cetera. So, and meta discourse about learning. It's always good to talk about that. And actually, I think that's Plenty. Any questions? Yeah, that was about. Yeah, so coming back to management, here's a really important part about management. Prepare your questions. Don't walk into class, you assign, reading. Don't walk into class and say, well, what do you think? That's a lame question. Come with questions. I mean, maybe you guys are good at it. Okay, that was another place where I stank on my course evaluations to start with. Didn't integrate the coursework and didn't run a good conversation in class. So it takes. The worst thing in any class I ever had was to take the exam and for the first time all semester see a good question. That made me so mad. It's like, you've been sitting on this for 15 weeks. Why didn't you? So anyways, prepare your questions. Because I should have prepared a good question for them.
So, how do you see, both of you wrote, you talked about looking for textbooks and questions that we might ask about audience and institution and level of the course. Where do you see your book, or I guess kind of a larger project of a flexible set of essays, where do you see that working best in an institutional setting? And where do you see maybe institutional settings not counting the Baptist seminary down the street? As pedagogically, where do you see that maybe it might not be the best option and something might?
So in my mind, my imagined audience are undergraduates. I would see this in a graduate class. And I wouldn't see it in seminary. So undergraduates, and depending on the way the class is structured, it could serve in, I think, most any type of undergraduate. I mean, an introductory class, an undergraduate introductory class. If you're doing a class on Paul, I suppose you could read it up front. Just, you could read Dieter Betz's article as one way to jump into Paul, and you could read this as a way to jump into Paul, and then move on to monographs or more detailed. So you might pull out one of these essays for a non-survey class if you just want something for students to read tomorrow that we'll talk about the next day. But that wouldn't be the whole book. That would just be an individual essay. For the whole book, in my mind, it's an undergraduate class, introductory type class. The other audience, it could be an adult reading class. So, if some 50-year-olds at church want to read a book, the lack of detail, the lack of footnotes, I don't think would be a problem for them. I mean, they would bring enough to bear that, they've read a bunch of other stuff and they would know, that's crazy, or I've heard that before, or, oh yeah, I know that's Romans 8. I mean, they would bring enough to bear that I think they could get past, and I think they would appreciate the ability to read quickly with a point.
So when you were mentioning potential reading you could give students, and you said scholarly articles, I just wondered how you do that effectively for undergrads. I specifically remember one scholarly article we were asked to read when I was an undergrad because I was so lost. I had no idea what was happening. And I just wonder, how do you kind of bridge the gap for students? Like, would you only bring those in at the very end of the semester, or kind of prep them before you assign?
Yeah, I never used scholarly articles with underclassmen.
Okay.
I used it with adult learners.
Okay.
But there the problem is Greek, right? I mean, most scholarly articles are going to have. I mean, there's a little bit of Greek, you can get around that, but I mean, it's a lot of Greek. Then that becomes kind of difficult to read around. I like Abraham Malherbe's article, Gentle as a Nurse. There's probably too much Greek in that. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Dunn's The New Perspective. Maybe that's doable. But again, that would be upper level classes. In an upper class, students might have had a year of Greek, in which case you can get by. So I don't know. Matthew Baldwin was asking people about articles to use in class, and I don't know what level he was. I assume it was probably an upper level. Was anybody in on that email, on that Facebook conversation with Matt
I've
Bolton?
seen it in Janet's also posted.
Oh, Janet.
on that.
Yeah. So I assumed it would have been an upper class. And at Matt's college, he probably gets upper level theology students, I would think. So maybe he could do that.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you would be willing to share a syllabus that would accompany this kind of book to make it obvious how this kind of inductive, deeper kind of cycles of learning builds upon this kind of textbook.
Sure, I'll do that.
Or, yeah, that would be really helpful.
I'll probably play around with it for a month. I will do that.
So what kind of assessments and assignments do you tend to use for companies? I mean, and as students, you prep them with the book and you get them reading the New Testament, and how do you get them engaged then in practice being informed readers, right?
Yeah.
With one another and using the Bible as, to support some kind of proposition, and using the text to support claims made about it. So I mean, I'm really, I'm really intrigued by how innovative and different this model is. I mean, having these 7 propositions, and I can imagine, you take a class that's kind of designed around, say, 7 propositions, and as you say, like, if the student, comes away from the class, the desired outcome for the reader is to learn 7 basic propositions about the New Testament, it will be success.
Yeah, but I do. I mean, in my mind, they're reading more than this.
Right, I understand. Yeah, I understand. And so, and I was really intrigued by that because I could imagine there is a stickiness to that, right? I mean, it's to that simplicity and that the kind of elegance of that, because 2 years from now they could easily recite those 7 propositions, and then that in turn they would have other knowledge that would depend on those propositions, and so there's a nice organization to that, but I still struggle with how I see this kind of synthetic textbook working in tandem with the assignments that I would assign, like the reading I would assign, and then the other assignments that I would give them.
Yeah. Well, so each chapter has questions at the end.
Right.
And I tried a variety of questions. I mean, so some are exegetical. Look at John chapter 1, 1 to 2. That's not a question. I can't think of one. But and whatever. One question was look at Luke 1, 1 through 4 and John 20, probably 18 through 20, and which do you think was written first? Why? So some questions are not talked about in the chapter, but now that you've read the chapter, and you know that there are 4 different voices going on here for different reasons, so go look at these 2 verses and see what you think. So some questions try to drive them to a specific New Testament text, and some are just really reflective. What do you? So I think one about Paul was Paul didn't know Jesus. How does that strike you? What does that make you think about the origin of Christianity? So some are response questions. And some kind of bridge the 2. So one question actually, Chris Mount gave me this one on the New Testament. It's written in Greek. So now in our English Bibles, we translate adelphoi as brothers and sisters. So Chris has found that his students think that the text says adelphoi kai adelphai. so they'll be like, oh, isn't that so great that Paul thought to mention the women as well? Well, that's an interesting thing to think. So the question is, does it make a difference to you whether that's what Paul really wrote, or whether that he used a word that we interpret the way we interpret it? So to say brothers and sisters is now our interpretation of this. So if you want to argue it's gender neutral, that's one argument. But if but the other thing is, well, this is how we think. This is how we would talk today. I mean, so what does that make you think about the translation now? So there are questions there to help the student reflect on a small point, a larger issue. So that's one way. But the other thing is, like, there are 4 Gospels. That says a little bit about each of the 4. So I mean, I see that setting up for the larger part of the class where you're actually going to take a deeper dive into each of the 4. So, so hopefully this essay sets you up so that you come to the 4 like, oh man, what that guy said. I really want to find out more about this Luke's Gospel or this Matthew's Gospel. With Matthew's Gospel, and so, so then does the teacher use the questions or not? Does the teacher ignore the questions, or does the teacher ask the students, read the essay, provide a written, I would have them provide a written answer, choose 2 questions and provide a written answer to them. Any 2 of you choose. And then, depending on the class is going, maybe I would insist that you do 7. I mean not 7, but that you would do number 6. Do that one specifically. So one part of your answer is that these questions are trying to make them dive in deeper. Or the reflection question is to make you think about the material and make it your own. And then, but you're moving on. This is 7 chapters depending on, that's like 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, then you're moving on, right? So you've got this as kind of a quick basis, but now you're going to move on. You're going to take the deeper dive into however it is to teach. What are you going to read next? Maybe next you're going to read Mike White's book on the different versions of the pictures of Jesus, or maybe you're going to take a really deep dive into Mike's early Christianity book. That's what's the narrative you want to set up. What's your goal? Or maybe you want to move and look at the kind of ethical teachings like the New Testament or the Christologies. For me, my next move is to make them read the New Testament. And so one of the things that I did to prove that they read the New Testament, I would give them material from the New Testament, find the reference. So it's simple. As you're reading through Luke 2, you say, there's the Mary song and, whatever. That's simple, but at least they went through Luke's Gospel. And now I can come to class. And then those become canonical texts. So, Mary's song, the Magnificat, is a great sample of Lucan theology. So they've read it. We can talk about the Magnificat. And that becomes an anchor for our conversations of Luke. And then I'll use Luke 4 and do redaction criticism on Jesus in the synagogue. And that becomes an anchor point. So in class, we would look carefully at Luke 4, and then then at some point move to a sermon in Acts to see how the themes repeat themselves. So that I would be going in class through specific texts, and so that's where you will have to, what text do you like as an indicator of Lucan theology or Matthean theology or Johannine, right? You're going to choose those texts. There are some deep dives actually in the New Testament's written in Greek chapter. There's like 3 pages on John chapter 3, where there are a lot of significant semantic things in the Greek in the first half of John chapter 3. So I talk about that. So that's kind of a deep dive into John. And might be something that you want to pick up on when you talk about John's Gospel. You might find some keys to Johannine theology there that you, or not. So I would have them identify these texts. Then it just becomes a quick quiz. Magnificat, where is it? Then we go to Luke chapter 2. Well, that's stupid, but it becomes something that we can talk about, right? So. And for some texts, it's important to know that they're at the beginning or they're at the end. On the Emmaus Road, it's critical that it's at the end of Luke. So that's one thing. And then now that we've looked at Jesus in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4, so here are the themes that are in Luke's Gospel. Now your assignment is to read through Luke and Acts and find references, find examples of these themes. Again, that's almost mindless on their part. But then they'll come to class and they'll, I thought whatever. And then, okay, that's a great example. And then I'll start talking about that text. And here's how we're seeing the theme of the fulfillment of Scripture or inclusion of marginalized, whatever. you know, and then someone else, well, I thought this text, and like, you know, all of a sudden, you know, so like fulfillment of prophecy in Luke Acts, right? There's got to be like a bazillion examples. And they'll come like, I found 4, you know, and they think you're like, I found 4. And then you're going around class and like, you know, everybody found 4 different ones. And so then they realize, my gosh, like this is ubiquitous, this really is here. And then you're talking about, you know, then you start talking about how it's being used and so that's how I would move from this to the next deep dive into the New Testament and going through those texts. But then don't get bogged down. And that's the real challenge with the New Testament instruction, get bogged down. Because you want to get past that so that you can get to the next cycle where you can ask big synthetic, not the New Testament written in Greek, not my simple observation synthetic questions, but the big ones. Who is Jesus? What is a Christian? What is the good life? You know, ask those big questions, or whatever big question that enthralls you with the New Testament. You want to get to that, but you know, you've taken them through so that now they have some ammo. And another thing I do, I tell them on the first day, usually it's depending on the class, but by the way, on the final exam, you're going to write a major essay. The question is, who is Jesus? And so, get ready for it. And so if you can construct little assignments throughout the course that contribute to that, that's really awesome. So that, and then they should actually start writing, because writing is thinking and it's prototype. So, you know, you don't want them to wait till the end of the class and then write the first thing. So here's this really anti-pedagogical thing that we do in all our classes. Midterm final paper. 66% of that comes when the class is over. So how does that contribute to learning? You know, and you'll find most students won't come pick up their stuff. So, you know, you have these wonderful comments, and they don't come pick up their papers. All it becomes is read my mind. You know, there's no educational part. Your assessment doesn't become part of the learning process. So, writing as they're going through this and building towards something bigger. Then they get to the end, and it's not like, who is Jesus? It's like, yeah, I've been waiting on that. And I mean, there is no right essay to that, right? You know, who knows what they want to talk about. But they should come, you know. The essays were much better when I told them it was coming than when I just, you know, put it on the final exam and assumed that they've, you know, been thinking about this for 15 weeks. So the goal is to get them to learn, manage the process. Now that's what elementary school teachers do, but that, you know, they don't have to go write and learn, right? So I mean, there's your competing interests. I mean, you know, you can't do everything perfectly, but you know, just try a little bit each time. And your class is a prototype. Next time you prototype something again, it's iterative. And after 30 years, you're Alfred Ralphson teaching a class that, you know, is to die for.
You said you had, you taught a class at Loyola, and that you had a lot of Roman Catholic students who, you know, knew certain aspects about the biblical text, but maybe not certain other historical aspects. How did that work when you ask a question like, who is Jesus? Do you have people who are just like, well, I see it says this. The definition of Chalcedon says this. I mean, does that happen?
You don't know Catholics very well.
Remember that quiz I gave you? I mean, people would usually get 2 right.
Okay, I retract my question.
2, maybe 4. I mean, there were
that's fair.
No, you're really overshooting. You're overshooting what they know. Which, I mean, and I don't mean that as a criticism of them. I mean, but you know, we've all spent. Well, you have. We've spent decades, and you are about to spend decades. You are in your process, on your way to decades, and so, you know, you come to someone who's just, you know, kind of floated through, and you know, in Sunday school the right answer was Jesus. Well, no, that's not the right answer to everything. Allison?
How transparent transparent are you with students about how you've constructed the course? Like, is that a thing that you go through on the first day? And do you explain to them the whole iterative process when you assign essays? Like, how clear is that to them versus how clear it is to you in your planning?
So you're going to get students 75% of the way through the class asking you, is there a paper due in this class? There was a syllabus and we all read it on the first day, and it's just kind of amazing that you're the only one who remembers that syllabus. So yeah, I talk about it a little bit. I don't beat it to death because I know there's only so much they're going to remember, but you keep talking about it. I backpacked once with a guy who's an electrician. So he's a union guy. And union laborers take breaks. That's what they do. So, we're going down the trail making good time, and Mike's like, break time. I'm like, what? What? I mean, and it's a 15-minute break. And I'm just like, throw down your pad, slam the power bar and some water, and get going, It's like an Indy 500 pit stop, like bam, bam, go. It's like, so pack off, lay back. When we reached the campsite, I never felt better in my life on a backpacking trip. So my answer to you is, time that you waste managing the process is time that you gain in the outcome. So you may, and I felt, as a teacher, I felt bad about taking time to manage the process, because it's like time I'm not lecturing, and I should be pumping knowledge into their heads. But time spent managing the process is time spent improving what they retain. And you can say, you can give 75% instead of 100, but they're going to remember a much bigger and benefit from a much larger percentage at 75%. So yeah, I take time to engage in meta discourse about the class throughout, with each assignment, when you give it back, a lot of that.
Can I come back to a debating point about, the essays are really, they are readable. They're beautifully readable, as you said. I think they're of varying technical difficulty. I don't know, in fact, I'm going to interrupt myself to say, did you know how on Microsoft Word you can ask it if what you're writing is within the age of like a 14-year-old, or, you know what I mean? There's a little thing under,
in Word?
You know what I'm talking about? In Word?
Yeah. Yes.
Where you can check what Word thinks is because when I had to do this translation that was rejected basically from the new Common English Bible, whatever that Bible is, they told me my translation had to pass words 14-year-old knows, and then they wound up basically doing a soft rewrite of the new RSV. It's a whole really different thing that I thought was really cool. It's like, oh, Dad, where is your instrument of torture? It's not like, oh, Dad, where's your sting? But anyway, did you check in terms of readability? Or did your publisher? Because that's one of the tools that gets used, actually.
I don't know the publisher did. There were 4 readers at the publisher.
Okay, so let me just keep going then on the essay. So the essays are really readable, I think. Although I think they're not. I'm not sure you can give them to high school kids, and I'm not sure you can give them to all college kids. I mean, I think there's still a there's a literary height to these, which I'm prized. So I would say it's good. The issue I want to come back to is the one that Brandon raised about references.
Mm-hmm.
And it relates a little bit to some of what they can do with the questions that you ask them. And that is the difference between an opinion and an argument. And that if the course is meant to put them in the position of having to craft their own arguments, if the essay format doesn't have them summon evidence for their arguments, if they don't see you doing it, can they learn to do it, is the question. As much as I grant your concern about proof texting, isn't there a form of academic and discourse that requires summoning evidence that actually, ironically, can look a lot like proof texting in a confessional context, but it is what we do in terms of weighing the evidence in order to offer what we think to be better arguments rather than lesser. And, feel free to push
Yeah.
back on the
Well,
book, but don't you want them, when they write your essay, who is Jesus? Not just to say, kind of middle of the road-ish statements that they've picked up along the way without much textual reference at all, but they're just kind of going for the, the vanilla.
Yes, and I, so two things. I mean, there aren't footnotes, but I think there is evidence for the arguments I present. I don't, sometimes I think I'm just like, okay, here's what people say and let's move on. But I tried to provide reasons for things that were said. The second thing is, again, I don't see this as the be-all and end-all of 15 weeks. This is the start, and so what comes next. So to the point about Jesus, yeah, your opinion, we will get past that. So the first part of getting past your naive opinion is to understand there are 4 different Gospels. They're not eyewitness accounts. They have agendas and ideas. Now, what is the actual detailed evidence for that? That's what I see happening when you finish reading this book. Is if I were teaching class, this is what comes next. So the remedy to where do they actually get details, to me that's phase 2 of the class. You move into, so I mean, this is like whetting the appetite, setting the table. I mean, the problem with the other approach though is that the payoff doesn't come until week 15. So, I mean, I want there to be payoff today, so that you feel like you got something, and that, okay, this is interesting. Now I'm ready to move on. I mean, I'm trying to really get you engaged, and to see that there is something here, and now you chewed, you digested, and now move on. So it was a debate with the publisher. It was just and sometimes there are some references in there. And the real problem became, when the camel's nose is under the tent, where does it end? I mean, the minute you put a reference in, I need to put a reference in at the end of every sentence. Not every, but I mean, so, trying to avoid that. And, if I were, so here the problem here is also, so my imagined reader is the student, but also I have to be talking to the teacher because they're the ones who's going to buy the book. I mean, well, they're the one who's going to sign. They have to make the decision. And that was the one of the external readers raised that question. He would not use the book specifically for that reason.
Because of the references?
The lack of references. Because that's not what he wants to model to his students. Yeah. My retort is, I want to model to the students good writing. And that's way more important in the long run, in my opinion.
But isn't good writing open to counterstatement on the basis of the evidence, and hence making clear that in this instance I'm prioritizing the Galatians argument because it's the earlier argument and because X, Y, Z, than merely going to Romans 9-11 or synthesizing Paul vis-a-vis reading Pauline letters as occasional. And that's, that's the evidence both is partial, and we have to make arguments on the basis of selected items within the evidence. And that's,
Well, I agree with that, and again, I think, so the first challenge is getting students to read. That's the first challenge.
Yeah.
So, presenting them, when I would read something, I would argue with every sentence. And the result is, oftentimes you don't, I still don't remember reading that book. But often is you don't finish. So, so the first goal is that they actually finish. And in my imaginary situation, there's a teacher who is following. So you come to class and get precisely those questions. Where did he get this idea? And that's where you as the professor then, now it's golden. Now you get to step in and scratch their itch. That's a part of why I did what I did.
So it's priming the pump then for the kind of debate over the evidence.
Because if that were the 15 weeks of the class, it'd be a pretty dismal class. And that would be, that's all you did in 15 weeks?
Well, no, I think you chose beautifully in the theses that you made I think my question would be both that and then also about whether they should read in the New Testament earlier on in order to be in a position to interact with the why this matters-ness.
Well, they could actually. I mean, if it's a 3-hour class, and so is that 6 hours of homework? Is that what the undergraduate equation is?
Yes.
So if you read 2 chapters a week, that leaves 4 hours to read something else, or to answer a couple. So I mean, that could be being done. And in fact, that would actually be better, because then if you could read a lot of the New Testament in that same time, and then when you finish this and move on, now you've already read a bunch of the New Testament and you're actually ready. So I mean, that would be a good idea.
Well, you're really right that the conventional approach, and Brown as well, will leave a lot of just pieces on the table. And trying to gain a synthetic frame, I think is really...
I mean, we have to read these books. I mean, no, these are fun to read. but it's not.
Well, I mean, and one function of a textbook, too, is also to serve as a later reference, possibly. And I'm curious, I mean, I don't know how much, I mean, that's always on my mind. And I think the textbook adoption, too, is whether, and my solution has been, I think assigning, for example, the HarperCollins Bible is something that they could have on their bookshelf, and when they have questions about a text, they can get some answers from that. The drawback of that is that they read the notes rather than the text, and so there's always...
and the reference textbooks usually get sold back. You and I are the only people who kept them. Us, we're the kind of people who keep those books. Most students sell them back.
Right, and that's true for me. I think it's probably for most students. But but what are students going to do when they have a question about the New Testament? They're listening to MSNBC or Fox News or something. They hear something and they I want to check that out. What do they do if we're trying to make them help them become lifelong learners in hopefully using this text, we're reading this text as adults, right?
They're going to Google it. So
as citizens, right? And so they're going to Google it. So is that where we engage them in the class?
You need to talk about it in
exactly.
class. Yeah, you absolutely need to.
And I'm curious, in the online iterations of this textbook and its later development, do you foresee incorporating that in online resources, or how helping students navigate?
Depends on how much control I have. I mean, in the ideal world, I lose control of this. I mean, I don't need control of this. So I mean, Margie will have a sense of what a good essay will look like, and you'll have a good sense of what an essay will look like, and then they'll be there. And then there'll be choices. That's the point. And hopefully, so one nice thing about working, I chose to work with Anselm because I went to a teaching the Bible session, and at the end the guy got up and gave a question. He said, well, hi, my name's this, and I'm an editor with Anselm. I was at this, one of the things I wanted to do at that conference was to find a publisher of my book. And I'm like, well, this dude's a publisher, and he's at this session. That means he's actually committed to undergraduate teaching. So he was my first conversation, and then it turned out to be my only conversation. Because he was someone, so Anselm is committed to, so they don't write the books that you need to read. But the books, they have a good ear for undergraduates. So
they have a growing library of resources like this.
Yeah.
Sheila Matthews, right, that's a kind of a textbook out, and others that, from Anselm, they're in this market increasingly.
Well, that's the space they want to, yeah. Yeah, it's Catholic, so in a sense that's their sweet spot, but they're not devoted to that. In fact, one of the external leaders, so one was from Loyola, but another was evangelical.
What study Bible do you assign? Or do you assign that?
I just use the Oxford. But I usually create my own digital text. Something like 2 Corinthians. How do you want them to read it? Canonical or reconstructed? Depends on the class. how do you want it formatted. So I do a lot of PDFing.
Yeah, and like having students read it in various formats.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, in Mark's story, Mark is reproduced without any numbers or anything in editorial revisions, and you just read it. And like I try to I've assigned that as just their first encounter with it, has to read Mark in this format.
Yeah. So you ask. I mean, the other thing is, people just want to be cheap. They'll just use your own Bible, whatever's at home. Some kids are coming with these really big Bibles.
Or their phone.
Or now, yeah, well, sure. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.